DV013, title, His Paycheck Vanished, The Wage Garnishment Trap. Formula, horror, duration 10 min. A man in the Midwest finally found a good job after years of recession hardship. Then he opened his paycheck and discovered a quarter of it was gone. Taken by a major credit card company he hadn't heard from in years. No warning, no phone call, no letter, just money. Vanished. This is the story of how wage garnishment works in America and why millions of workers are losing their paychecks to debts they can barely remember. A man in the Midwest spent 25 years building a career. He worked steadily, raised a family, and lived what most people would call a normal, responsible American life. Then the 2008 financial crisis hit. He lost his job. Like 8.7 million other Americans, between December 2007 and June 2009, he was caught in the worst economic collapse since the Great Depression. The unemployment rate peaked at 10% in October 2009. In some industries, it was much worse. He couldn't find work. Not for months. Not for over a year. The bills didn't stop. He burned through savings, sold his home, not by choice, but by necessity. The mortgage was underwater, and the payments were impossible without income. During those desperate months, credit card debt was the last thing on his mind. He had cards with balances. Who didn't? But when you're choosing between feeding your family and making a minimum payment to a major credit card company, the choice isn't really a choice at all. The credit card bills went unpaid. Then they went to collections. Then they went quiet. He assumed, like millions of Americans assume, that old debt eventually goes away, that there's some kind of statute of limitations, that if nobody calls you about it for years, it's dead. He was wrong. Here's what this man didn't know. While he was struggling through the recession, losing his home, and fighting to rebuild his life, a major credit card company had not forgotten about him. The debt hadn't disappeared. It had been traveling through the legal system. The credit card company, or more likely a debt buyer who purchased the account, had filed a lawsuit against him. In many states, creditors can file suit to collect on unpaid debts, and the process often begins with a summons. But here's the critical detail. The summons was likely served at his old address, the home he had already lost. He never received it. He never knew he was being sued. When he didn't appear in court, because he didn't know there was a court date, the creditor won a default judgment. This is staggeringly common. According to a 2020 report by the Pew Charitable Trusts, approximately 70% of debt collection lawsuits end in default judgments. The debtor never shows up because the debtor never knew. A default judgment is a court order that says you owe the money, and once a creditor has a judgment, they have tools, powerful tools, the most devastating of which is wage garnishment. Wage garnishment is exactly what it sounds like, a court order that directs your employer to withhold a portion of your paycheck and send it directly to your creditor. Under federal law, the Consumer Credit Protection Act of 1968, creditors can garnish up to 25% of your disposable earnings. That's your take-home pay after taxes and mandatory deductions. 25%. For someone making $40,000 a year, that's $10,000 gone. For someone barely getting by, it can be the difference between making rent and being homeless. And here's what makes it especially brutal. In most states, the garnishment order goes to your employer, not to you. Your employer is legally required to comply. They have no choice. They start withholding the money from your next paycheck. You, the employee, often find out when you check your bank account and the numbers don't add up, or when you look at your pay stub and see a line item you've never seen before. That's exactly what happened to this man in the Midwest. After years of struggle, he finally landed a new job, decent pay, a chance to rebuild. He worked his first pay period, eager to see that paycheck hit his account. Then he looked at the numbers. 25% of his disposable income had been garnished, taken by the credit card company or the debt buyer holding his old account under a judgment he never knew existed, from a lawsuit he never knew was filed, served at an address where he no longer lived. No phone call warning him, no letter to his current address, nothing. Just a quarter of his paycheck, gone. This man's story is not unusual. It is the norm. A 2016 report by the ADP Research Institute analyzed payroll data from 13 million employees and found that approximately 7% of American workers had their wages garnished in any given year. That's roughly 1 in 14 workers. In some states, the number is much higher. In 2019, ProPublica published an investigation showing that in certain zip codes in the South and Midwest, predominantly Black and low-income communities, garnishment rates exceeded 10% of all workers. According to federal investigators, the debt collection industry files millions of lawsuits every year. A 2020 report by the National Consumer Law Center estimated that debt collectors file approximately 4 million lawsuits per year in the United States. 4 million. And the system is designed to produce default judgments. Service of process. The legal requirement to notify someone they're being sued is easily circumvented. Summons are left at old addresses. They're handed to neighbors who throw them away. In some documented cases, process servers have filed false affidavits claiming they served someone when they never did. This is called sewer service. The papers go straight to the sewer instead of to the defendant. Once the default judgment is in place, the creditor has extraordinary power. Beyond wage garnishment, they can freeze bank accounts. In some states, they can place liens on property. They can garnish tax refunds, and the judgment itself earns interest. In some states, post-judgment interest rates run between 6 and 12% annually. The debt grows even as you're paying it. This man found himself trapped in a cycle. A quarter of every paycheck went to a debt from a previous life, a debt that had likely been sold for pennies on the dollar to a buyer who then used the courts to extract full value, plus interest, plus legal fees, plus court costs. The legal protections that exist are real, but they require knowledge that most people don't have. Under the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, the FDCPA, passed in 1977, debt collectors are prohibited from using deceptive or unfair practices to collect debts. If service of process was improper, a default judgment can potentially be vacated, thrown out by the court. But you have to know to file a motion. You have to know which court to go to. You usually need a lawyer. Some states have begun reforming their garnishment laws. In 2020, New York passed a law increasing the income exemption threshold, protecting more low-income workers from garnishment. In 2021, Illinois raised its protected minimum from the federal minimum wage to 45 times the state minimum wage per week. But in most of America, the rules haven't changed significantly since the Consumer Credit Protection Act was passed in 1968. The 25% threshold is more than half a century old. It hasn't been adjusted for the reality of modern living costs. For this man, the path forward involved contesting the judgment, proving improper service, and negotiating a settlement. It took months. It required legal help that wasn't free, and during those months, the garnishment continued. Some people in his situation never escape. They change jobs, and the garnishment follows them. They move states, and the creditor domesticates the judgment in the new state. The system is efficient at extracting money from people who have the least of it. Here's what this story reveals about debt in America. The system doesn't require that you know you're being sued. It requires that someone attempted to tell you. And attempted is a low bar. 70% of debt collection lawsuits end in default judgments. That means in the majority of cases, the debtor never shows up. The creditor wins automatically, and the full machinery of the state, courts, sheriffs, employers, lines up to collect. Wage garnishment is not a rare, extreme remedy. It is a routine tool used millions of times a year against working Americans. It falls hardest on the people who can afford it least. If you owe an old debt, it has not gone away. If you've moved and haven't updated your address with former creditors, you may already have a judgment against you and not know it. You can check by searching your name in your state's court records system. And if you get served with a lawsuit, even for an old debt, even for a small amount, show up. Respond. Because a default judgment is the most expensive mistake you never knew you made. This man in the Midwest did everything right the second time around. He found a new career. He tried to rebuild, and the system punished him anyway, not for being irresponsible, but for being broke at the wrong time. That's the wage garnishment trap. It doesn't catch the reckless, it catches the unlucky. If you've ever dealt with wage garnishment, drop your story in the comments.